Ladies and gentlemen, we will get started in 1 minute, so if you could please take your seats. Ladies and gentlemen, if you could please take your seats, we will get started in 1 minute. Thank you. Welcome and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Amila Golich, and I am the Assistant Director for Programs at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. It's my pleasure to welcome you to one of the first programs of our season this fall, as well as the very first program in our Food Fuel Finance series this year. We're excited and delighted to welcome Ambassador Ertharin Cousin here tonight to share her insights on how the private sector can and why it should increase investment in the Global South's agriculture sector. The Food Fuel Finance series is generously sponsored by the CME Group, and we at the Council extend our heartfelt thanks to you for your continued support. As well, the Council is a membership organization, and we thank our members for their support, which enables us to produce affordable, accessible, and independent content. If you are not yet a member, this may be the perfect time to join. We have so much in store for you, so I hope that you consider one of our membership levels, which begin at $100. As I said, we have lots in store for you, but also a few changes that you need to be aware of. As you may have noticed, this program, our evening programs are now beginning a little bit earlier at 5:30 p.m. and ending at 6:30 p.m. We do welcome our members and their guests to stay for a networking reception following the program at 6:30 p.m. So our cash bar will be open then for you. Turning back to tonight, please note that we are on the record and we are live streaming. We welcome your engagement on social media, but please turn your phones on silent mode. While you are doing that, please also take a moment to log into conferences.io at chi.cnf.io. We will be taking questions later in the program through this online app, as well as directly from the room, from our in-person audience. A brief disclaimer. The Chicago Council has for nearly a century provided an independent and nonpartisan platform for a variety of different perspectives to promote deeper global understanding and active U.S. engagement in the world. Please note that the views of the people that we host are their own and do not represent institutional views or positions of the Council. Before I turn it over, I wanted to spend a few moments introducing Ambassador Ertharin Cousin because she has quite a biography and a profile and deserves to be highlighted. A Chicago native, Ambassador Ertharin Cousin comes to join the Council as a distinguished fellow in the Global Food and Agriculture Program. She was previously at the helm of the world's largest humanitarian organization, the UN World Food Program, and before that, she served as U.S. Ambassador to the UN Food and Agriculture Agencies in Rome. She spent many years fighting global hunger, but also hunger in the United States when she had several leadership positions at America's Second Harvest, which is now Feeding America. We're really excited to have Ambassador Ertharin Cousin here tonight, as well as a member of the Council team for the longer term. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Ambassador Ertharin Cousin.
Well, thank you for that very, very generous introduction. That was very nice. And I always say when I hear someone introduce me like that, I wish my mother were in the audience. Tonight, my mother is in the audience, so thank you very much, Mom. I do very much appreciate this opportunity to work with the Chicago Council as a distinguished fellow. Between my time here at the Council and at Stanford, where I serve as a distinguished lecturer and a visiting fellow in the Center on Food Security and Environment, I will continue performing the research work and the advocacy work in support of ending global hunger and malnutrition. But before I go any further, I need your help. Alicia Black, who is the Vice President of Food and Agriculture here at the Council, just celebrated a birthday. And she thinks we all forgot. So I need you all to join me in saying, happy birthday, Alicia. All right. So back to the issues at hand. Yes, I have been called the woman who feeds the world. I've been labeled the woman who believes that we will end hunger. And sometimes I'm simply called a hunger warrior. I accept all these titles, not with sarcasm, but with the truth of these statements. Because I do believe we can end hunger in our lifetimes. The question is not can we end hunger in our lifetimes, but do we have the public will, and can we muster the collective action that is required to make the possibility of ending hunger a reality? Particularly during times when countries are looking more at their own interest, and there is more nationalism on driving the international and global dialogue. That should not stop us from doing what is necessary. And I do believe that ending hunger is not some wild-eyed, irrational optimism. And if I can quote the author Matt Ridley, I am a rational optimist. Rational because I've arrived at this optimism not through temperament or through instinct, but by looking simply at the evidence. And the evidence demonstrates that we have the tools to end hunger. We know what work we must perform, what policies government must implement, and what financing is required. So I hope during our brief time together tonight, I will convince each and every one of you that you too can become a rational optimist, and that you leave this room accepting not only that we can end hunger, but that there is an opportunity for private sector participation in ending hunger and performing this work. To begin, there is little argument regarding the growth potential for agribusiness across the globe. Today, the global value of food and agriculture businesses exceed $5 trillion US. And each year, this number increases. If current trends continue, by 2050, global caloric demand will increase by 70%, and crop demands for human consumption and animal feed will increase by at least 100%. In fact, the value of the sub-Saharan African agriculture market alone is set to top $1 trillion US by 2030. I recognize, okay, I'm a realist, I'm a pragmatist about this as well, and I realize that there are incredible challenges if the African continent is to seize this trillion-dollar opportunity. And I recognize that as we speak today, some 100 million of the farmers across sub-Saharan Africa farm less than 2 hectares of land. And some 80% of those smallholder farmers are poor. In fact, more than 30% of this rural population is chronically hungry. And 35% of their children under 5 are stunted. And just last week, my former agency, WFP, along with FAO and EFAD, issued the 2017 State of Food Insecurity, or State of Food Security, noting an additional 38 million people have joined the rolls of the hungry in this world, raising the number to 815 million people around the world. And as a percentage of total population, the lion's share of those already on the hunger rolls and those newly added to the hunger rolls live in sub-Saharan Africa. Yes, I admit this number alone would suggest the evidence does not support my optimism about our ability to end hunger, particularly when the population projections suggest that by 2050, the bulk of the world's population growth will take place on the African continent. An additional 1.3 billion people will be added to the continent between now and 2050. I lay out these challenges as well as the opportunity because any good evidentiary case must accept that there are challenges and will perform the work to overcome those challenges in order to achieve the goal. To end hunger, we must not only seize the opportunity in sub-Saharan Africa, where the percentage of population hunger is greatest, but we must also solve the problem of hunger in Asia, where the whole number of people facing hunger is greatest. In sub-Saharan Africa, it's a percentage of the population, but when you look at the 815 million people, the majority of them live in Asia. But because the populations are largest, it's a whole number, not a percentage of the population. But today, we know that there's been the green revolution in Asia. We've seen China move from the country 50 years ago that the world said would never feed itself, to today where Asia accounts for 19% of the global food and agriculture exports, and 31% of the total food and agriculture imports. China and India together account for 28% of the world's cereal consumption and 40% of the world's palm oil consumption. And China alone consumes 25% of the world's beef and 27% of all the soy produced in the world. Yet, today, even with this region's increasing GDP and these growing numbers of consumption, some 395 million farms are operated by smallholders, most of them with no more than 1 hectare of land. And the State of Global Food Security report also noted a hunger spike in Southeast Asia. This unexpected spike is even more worrying when you consider the population projections, which suggest that by 2050, Asia's population is expected to increase from 4.3 to 5.1 billion. The challenges of growing population across the Asian region will undoubtedly increase those food demand numbers, with not only higher cereal consumption, but also consumption of higher value produce and protein. And across the Latin American region, even with its recent history as a net agricultural exporter, more than 50% of the food production comes from 14 million mostly poor smallholder farmers. Latin America's population topped 625 million in 2016 and is expected to reach 775 million by 2050. What that means with Africa, Asia, and Latin America is that by 2050, 85% of the world's population will live in one of those 3 locations. And just as a point of reference, at the same time, during that same time period, Nigeria will overtake the US to become the world's 3rd largest country. These numbers reflect the tremendous opportunities and the tremendous risks. We live on a very small planet. And a suggestion that we can focus on our national security and ignore the food security challenges of those in other parts of the world is a misnomer. If I can paraphrase Gandhi, if you'll allow me that, when he said that to a mother who cannot feed a hungry child, a piece of bread is the face of God. And our failure to provide hope and opportunity for people where they live, they will not stay. These communication tools that we all carry around in our pockets have penetrated communities across the globe where people now know, if I cannot feed my child here, there's some place over there where I can feed my child. So we cannot perform the same business as usual. If we fail to enhance and improve agricultural practices around the entire global system, if we fail to address the challenges of climate change, and if we fail to more equitably implement the requisite changes across the global community, not only will we fail to end hunger, but the world will witness an ever number of increasing people hungry and malnourished on our very small planet. So yes, to overcome the inherent challenges of increasing agricultural value chains and to seize the trillions of dollars of opportunity requires farm-to-fork systems improvements. Achieving these improvements will require collective action generated through smart partnerships, partnerships which must include the private sector. Yes, this collective action must include partnerships with governments, donors, civil societies, NGOs, the multilateral institutions, particularly the United Nations, as well as private sector, which must include the world's 500 million smallholders, as well as medium-sized and commercial farmers. Businesses across the sectors, including local, national, and international actors. Focusing on private sector, the business community, requires the community of development actors, donors, governments, and even some citizens to get comfortable with the notion that agricultural development is not charity or philanthropy. We will not succeed if businesses at every level don't make money, including the farmer. Yes, a farmer wants to feed his family, but he also wants to generate income. We must not romanticize smallholder farming and recognize that the same hope and economic opportunity each one of us wants, so does the smallholder farmer living in rural sub-Saharan Africa or in Uttar Pradesh in India. And just as an aside, many are asking, as this population grows, how do we address the youth bulge, the growing populations across these developing countries? How can agriculture serve as a pull factor for addressing the aging farmer problem and getting more people into farming and into agribusiness? As one prime minister said to me, how do we make agriculture sexy? And making agriculture sexy will not just require innovation, but require making agriculture across the entire food system a more lucrative industry. Does it make money? Yes, the early movers and smart executives realize and drive their teams to develop and implement sustainable solutions that will support universal opportunities for peace and prosperity while addressing the challenges of climate change. But that smart business executive, whether it's Unilever or DSM or Cargill, will tell you that they also keep a watchful eye on the bottom line. What is the return on investment? When will the investment deliver the returns? Whether that executive is a farmer with 2 hectares or a CEO of a multi-billion-dollar company, the organizational questions are the same. And no, profit must not come at the cost of further detriment to the poor. Yes, today there is our 500 million smallholder farmers, but we also need to realize in some countries, in many countries, those farmers provide 80% of their country's domestically produced food basket. Achieving zero hunger means the requisite value chains improvements must include these farmers, treating them as business owners and operators. Delivering equity, fairness, opportunity, and making a profit are not mutually exclusive concepts. This opportunity for business development exists along the entire value chain, from seeds and fertilizer, warehousing, distribution, banking, insurance, to milling, value-added processing, packaging, and new market opportunities for supply chains, including retail opportunities in places where urbanization is exploding. The private sector must and will create new, innovative, disruptive businesses, developing leapfrog opportunities, learning from the lessons of the past, using the technology available today that wasn't available 10 years ago to overcome the well-reported and often discussed constraints to agriculture development. On the horizon, things like data management, including blockchain, which will create databases to address the challenges of land registry and land management. And right now, as we're sitting here, drones can plant seeds at a rate of 100,000 trees per day, 1 per second, 10 times faster, or at 20% of the cost of hand planting trees. Imagine these same drones planting wheat or corn in fertile areas. Today, globally, 20% of all cultivated land, only 20% of all cultivated land is irrigated. 35% of the farms in India, 40% of the farms across all of Asia, with a paltry 3% across all of sub-Saharan Africa under irrigation. Moving farmers from rain-fed agriculture to irrigation has the potential to shift the paradigm for farmers across the entire developing world. Irrigated crops would increase the opportunity to grow higher value crops and to grow crops for more than one season each year. And with more farmers each year facing the rain challenges of climate change, irrigation will potentially overcome the risk of rains that don't come or come too little and too late. Imagine providing the irrigation that was necessary so that this hunger season is the last hunger season. Scaling up access to irrigation represents a private sector business opportunity across the entire spectrum, from manufacturing of the various diverse products that are necessary, sales, maintenance, and in the training sectors. And no matter what region of the world, every list of agricultural development enablers essential include transport, infrastructure development, or infrastructure improvements, the roads, the warehousing, the chilling stations. To date, China has seized upon this opportunity across the African continent. When I go into an airport now in any major capital on the African continent, there are Chinese business leaders that outnumber everybody, including the Africans sitting in many of these airports, because they're seizing the infrastructure development projects as a primary driver of increasing trade with the continent, as well as through their announced initiative of developing infrastructure across all of Asia, and Southern Asia in particular, through their, what they are calling their Silk Road Initiative, One Belt, One Road program, where they are planning to spend something along the lines of trillion for infrastructures over 68 countries. Yet the infrastructure development investment, whether in Africa, Asia, or Latin America, is not a closed one-country business opportunity. So to fully address the challenges of food insecurity through agriculture development requires capturing these and other business opportunities. But to do this, we also require government action. Governments willing to implement and adhere to policies that create the enabling environment which will allow businesses across the value chain to blossom and grow. Policies that transparently support predictive. Business likes predictability. So predictive, open markets, removing distortions from seeds and fertilizers, even during election season. Because what you see far too often is countries who pass the laws, but then as soon as there's a presidential election, they distribute subsidies. So any of the retail business structures that have been developed for seeds and fertilizers, the bottom falls out. Governments must eliminate these practices. The governments must eliminate barriers to access, to market access. Business of every type require adequate policy and a legal framework appropriately enforced by governments. Tall order. All countries aren't going to come along at the same pace, because it is a tall order. But it is achievable. Achievable like the challenge of financing. We must scale up the availability of financing for both farm, on-farm, and off-farm agriculture activities. A few banks and non-financial institutions have taken the initial steps to closing the gaps. We must encourage and support the implementation of new as well as traditional financial mechanisms by supporting investment guarantees, crop investment guarantees, supply chain financing, as well as for things like new irrigation schemes supporting group lending. We can't do it the way we've always done it, or we will not find the projects that are defined as bankable for investment. And we must support and encourage the development of innovative financing tools, including private equity and venture capital funds, particularly for infrastructure and other large capital investments. There's a good story to tell about the business opportunity for financial investment and financial inclusion. A fairly recent MIT and IMF study found that the elimination of blockages to financial inclusion has significant and unambiguous direct impact on GDP growth and productivity. Smarter allocation of resources and more efficient financial contracting result in stronger entrepreneurial activities and new business startups that increase aggregate output. Simply put, financial inclusion, access to capital for agriculture, and agribusiness can serve as the bridge between economic opportunity and achieving outcomes. Okay, again, I'm a pragmatist. Improving financial access doesn't mean lending to anyone at any cost. This is where regulation, supervision, and training come in. With finance, as with every other new tool along the value chain, must come research, capacity building, and training. Equitably improving food systems from farm to fork must also include delivering more and better related research. Research and data must always be available, as well as accessible and usable by the world's 500 million smallholder farmers, including women farmers. R&D should not only benefit medium and large commercial farmers. It must also raise the productivity and output of the smallholder farmer. This will not occur without additional funding, appropriate government action, and private sector participation. I was just talking to the CEO of Yara, a fertilizer company in Norway, who said to me that they have invested in new tools that will support better yields, but that requires training on how to use it. And they have invested in 400 agronomists that they're deploying across the developing world, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa and India, recognizing that it's a market share opportunity for them. Yes, the farmers will get better yields and they'll get more customers. Training. Training is a key component of delivering the change required. My mother, wise woman that she is, always said, we do better when we know how to do better. Giving a farmer improved seed or fertilizer without adequate training will not produce the results the farmer expects. Providing a new market opportunity without training farmers about the responsibility and long-term benefit of meeting their contractual requirements will not deter side selling. Making financial assistance available without the appropriate training in financial management is just a default waiting to happen. Providing access to irrigation even without training farmers on the benefit will not increase use of irrigation despite its acknowledged benefits somewhere else. And making storage tools accessible and affordable requires training, or we will not reduce post-harvest losses. Just as a note, 40% of everything that is cultivated in sub-Saharan Africa in an average year is lost through poor post-harvest handling. That totals more than all the food aid that is brought into the continent on an annual basis. So imagine if we could provide the tools and the training that was necessary to eliminate post-harvest waste. And training is a part of this solution. But one type of training does not fit every situation. Train the trainers, training through phone interventions, remote learning, ongoing access to information through sustainable communications tools like a really innovative tool that I saw in Kenya when I was there with dairy farmers called iCow. And what iCow does is for 2 Kenya shillings per month, a farmer can sign up and ask questions about his cow. Is he feeding the cow the right thing? Looking at the excrement of the cow, he can ask questions about the challenges that he thinks the cow is having. He can ask questions about whether or not when it rains, what type of changes should he make in the feeding patterns of the cow. As a result, iCow has resulted in an incremental increase in the amount of milk produced by dairy farmers and dairy breeders who are using this tool. So training that fits the individualized needs and specialized needs of those we serve and the community cooperatives, not the training we think they need. Training driven also by private sector capacity and innovation. These are just examples of the work that we know how to perform today. The tools that we have at our fingertips today that support the evidence, that provide the evidence that implementing these tools can ensure that we end hunger. But before I close, I would be remiss if I did not address the challenges and opportunities for gender equality. Women comprise 43% of the global agricultural labor force, and up to 50% in Eastern and Southeastern Asia and across Sub-Saharan Africa. Fully capturing the future productivity of global agriculture requires that we rely upon women being treated fairly and equally across the world. The Food and Agriculture Organization found that women's equal access to seeds and training and tools will result in a 20 to 30% increase in yields. Yes, we must treat women equally and equitably because humanity demands it. And for business, unequal treatment of women simply leaves money on the table. To meet the growing agricultural demand for increased food, fuel, and agricultural feed, we must make global agriculture from farm to fork more productive, lucrative, and sustainable. If you will allow me one metaphor, there is no silver bullet, and there's also no one-size-fits-all. But there are some basic tenets which I've tried to lay out here today, which are required to make the incremental but sustainable, durable, and scalable progress that is required. And private sector must play a role at every stage of the value chain. There is not just a corporate social responsibility motive, but also a lucrative business opportunity. To make the requisite entire food system improvements requires all partners prepared to work for multiple seasons. Because all of the things that I've just described won't happen in one agricultural season. The changes that are made that will not take hold in one harvest. This is the work that requires long-term vision. So while we must have patience, we must also work with passion. Passion derived from a sense of urgency. Ending hunger requires jobs and economic opportunity in agriculture. Global private sector and investment opportunities require moving beyond talking about what needs to get done and moving towards the work, performing the work that will make it happen. So working collectively, we can develop each of the opportunities for rural people and poor people to feed themselves, whether through on-farm or off-farm jobs. As I said in the beginning and outlined through these brief remarks, we have the tools. We know what it takes. We know what progress requires. The evidence is clear, supporting the rational optimism that we can end hunger in our lifetimes. With these collective actions, ending hunger is a possibility and can be a reality. Nelson Mandela, when working to end South African apartheid, once said, "It always seems impossible until it is done." When he uttered those words, ending apartheid seemed impossible to those who criticized, the activists and the visionaries and those who believed and willing to do the work. Just as today, ending hunger and malnutrition seems impossible to too many. But as I've said, we have the tools. will require the public, private, and individual will working collectively until ending hunger is done. Thank you all.
Thank you, Ambassador Cousin. That was wonderful. And we certainly have a lot of questions coming in online, so I think it's going to be a good discussion. We're going to open it up to the audience, to you directly. If you have a question, please raise your hand. We will have staff on hand with mics. Please make sure your question is a question, not a statement, and please wait for the mic to get to you. So would anybody like to start us off? Mr. Leo Melamed, right here in the third row. Just 1 second, Mr. Melamed. Just 1 second.
In the forefront, sorry. Which countries are in the forefront of doing the things that you're suggesting?
Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, much of the work that is happening is uneven, but I think we're making measurable differences in Rwanda. We're making measurable differences in Tanzania. We just completed work in Tanzania on creating a platform that includes private sector, government, the NGOs, as well as develops a sustainable and durable market that the team is now working to scale up from 130,000 to 250,000 smallholder farmers. Got a long way to go to get to that 100 million, but it's the progress, and you have a government supporting it. Ethiopia had a food crisis a year ago, you will recall, as a result of the El Nino impact on the agriculture in Ethiopia. But you didn't have starvation. You didn't have the 1980s because of the progress that has been made in smallholder agriculture, the progress that has been made by the government in investing in their own needs. Then in Asia, I was just in Laos, where the government has invested in an agricultural development plan that will move the traditional rice farmers into producing in a different way. It'll be interesting to see what happens because China's building a lot of dams across Laos and how that's going to affect the plans that the government has in place for these smallholder farmers. But I could spend a lot of time walking around the globe, but there is significant progress that is being made across the globe. It's not being made fast enough for us to meet the goals because the funding and the other issues that I've talked about today are not coming online at the level that is necessary to scale up and leverage the things that are working. But there is significant progress being made.
Further questions? Right there.
You spoke about post-harvest waste in sub-Saharan being about 40%. Are there parts of the world where it's much lower than that, and what are they doing differently that's making it a smaller number?
Yes, of course there are parts of the world. There are particular countries in each of the areas, whether you're talking about Africa, Asia, or Latin America, and it's directly related to infrastructure. It's related to what kind of facilities they have for storage, what kind of training they are giving the farmers. Ethiopia spent they spent money on 50,000 extension workers to support training on post-harvest handling to reduce the loss of post-harvest, the post-harvest losses in the country. You are seeing China has made progress since the 1990s in increasing storage facilities and infrastructure that supports the transport of product from the rural areas into the city that has gotten their post-harvest losses closer to the zero number. So there, again, we have all of these examples of places where it's working. We just need to ensure that we don't try to adopt the solutions that are working in other places, but we adapt the research and the technology behind what's working. So you know, in other words, large-scale storage spaces don't work in rural small communities. You need smaller storage spaces, but you know that you need storage spaces. And so adapting the information and research from other areas to the situation in which you're working is part of the challenge that operators must, whether they're NGOs or governments, or private sector working with smallholder, must help that community understand that just because it's working over there doesn't mean that it's going to work here.
Thank you. Further questions? Oh, right there behind you, Tanner? No. Raise your hand. Yeah, thank you. We'll get to you next.
You mentioned blockchain technology being used for land management. Can you expand on that a bit more, or just talk about who's doing that?
There are a number of operators. Everybody's looking for the prize. So you have a lot. You have NGOs that are investing in different blockchain. You have small technology companies that are both Africa-based as well as big. Some, I actually have a friend who I know who came from the United States and who received money from funders and is in Tanzania and Kenya and working with the government on developing a system for, or testing a system for the recording of deeds using blockchain technology. So it's an open field right now, and nobody has a lock on it. Because right now, as you know, if you know anything about blockchain, you know that there's a lot of skepticism about whether or not the system can work outside of a closed loop format because of the amount of energy and data that's required. And so overcoming those kinds of challenges, and I don't want to get too much in the weeds here, but overcoming those kind of challenges is what those small operators that are testing and working with different governments and different funders right now are testing and identifying and testing across sub-Saharan Africa as well as in India. There's a lot happening in India with these types of tools.
So we actually have a lot of interest on the question of technology. Somebody asks online, why shouldn't we expect the spread of new technology and automation in agriculture to displace more ag workers than they create?
The opportunity to make the system more efficient will require technology, which means that there may be fewer on-farm jobs, but it will create more off-farm jobs. And using technology to support post-harvest handling practices, but also value-added processing. You have very limited actual manufacturing going on the continent today. And so that's where what we often see is that every nation has begun their economic development first through developing their agriculture system. But that becomes a smaller and smaller portion of the GDP of the country as the economics of the country grow, because you have more off-farm activities that drive jobs and economic opportunity. And we expect to see the same thing in the developing world.
Thank you. And do we have another question over here?
First of all, it was very interesting how you connected farming to business and profit. Never thought about it like that. You mentioned China and how involved they are in Africa. So I'd like to know, where does America stand at this point, and what are we doing in terms of being involved in this new global food development?
Well, as a private sector, the private sector companies are all over Africa. I talked about Cargill and Monsanto and Unilever. I don't know if they're British or U.S. But there are any number of U.S. private sector companies that are investing in African agriculture and both on-farm and off-farm agribusiness opportunities. The U.S. government has led for a very long time in African agricultural development. President Obama had a program called Feed the Future, which has been now codified, and it is law, and so it is not an executive order, and the program continues. And they just announced the new USAID director just announced the new countries, including a number of African countries that will remain in the Feed the Future program. So the U.S. government has a significant influence. U.S. NGOs, U.S. private sector, all have significant influence on the continent. But it would be incorrect for me if I did not acknowledge that China has now become a larger trading partner with the continent than the United States.
Somebody else online asks, if a company came to you right now and asked you where they should invest in the ag sector, in which country in sub-Saharan Africa, how would you advise them? What would you say?
I would not advise them in public. There are any number of very good prospects for African agricultural investment, and I would love to have those conversations offline with anyone who's interested.
Excellent. We have a question right here.
Hi. I was just wondering, what kinds of ways are there to kind of prevent the private sector from taking advantage of vulnerable smallholders or vulnerable areas as they, try to invest in those areas, especially with regard to agricultural development?
I appreciate that question very much, and that was the point that I tried to make, is that this cannot be at the detriment, any investment cannot be at the detriment of smallholder farmers or any other landowners in, whether we're talking about in Uttar Pradesh in India or in sub-Saharan Africa. And that is where regulation from the government comes in. And it requires, all of this work requires the collective action of all parties, the NGO community, the farmers themselves, the academic community, as well as the local governments, who ultimately have responsibility for protecting their people.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, we have time for one more question, so we'll go online again. What advice would you give to ordinary Americans who want to become more involved in supporting food security around the world?
I love those kinds of questions. The reality of it is that you have voice. You have voice, first of all, with your government to ensure that the U.S. continues to invest in the development that is required to move agricultural development forward. When I first became U.S. ambassador, I had another ambassador. In fact, it was the ambassador from Venezuela, and I'll just smile when I say that, who came up and hugged me and said, "It is so good to have the U.S. leading." Because positive things happen when the U.S. leads. And you should all be proud of that. That is how we are seen around the world, as bringing that kind of positive, people-centered, human rights-centered change. But that will only continue if we as citizens demand that our government, our leaders, continue to support the investment in those activities. So use your voice.
Thank you so much for joining us, and please join me in welcoming Ambassador Earther Cousin and for her speech tonight.
Thank you all.
We'd also like to thank once again CME Group for their continued support of the Council and the Food Fuel Finance Series. Stay tuned for more Food Fuel Finance programs this coming year.